Thank you so much, Stephen. And also thank all of you for electing to come into this dark chamber rather than acquiring a better tan, let's say, outside and getting some ice cream cones. You can do that afterwards. It's such a great pleasure to be here. And as you know, I've been developing a series of themes which will come to a conclusion next week that have to do with the paradoxes of these vital signs, the images and the hieroglyphic inscriptions that have been my life work going back way too much time, at least 40 years or so. In these lectures, we have examined what I regard as a set of paradoxes. One would be signs that appear to have innate life, even in written form. We've examined issues such as technicians who seem to be highly proficient and yet are also ritual wonder workers. They're makers of miracles. And we've even concluded this current series of thoughts last week by examining what appear to be very still, silent images that are nonetheless boisterous with raucous sound. And I hope I was able to communicate some of that bustle of past life that would have existed 12 to 1300 years ago in the Yucatan Peninsula. Today, we start with the familiar once again, at least for some of you. And this is an image that is iconic, of course, in Western art history. It is of Alberto Giacometti's Walking Man. And this is a sculpture in bronze that comes from about 1960 or thereabouts. It too involves a paradox, which we will be contemplating today, this afternoon. The paradox being of what appears to be an utterly still, inert sculpture, in this case, cast of bronze, but nonetheless involving implicit movement. And we ask all sorts of questions of this particular work. We ask, who is this walking man? Where are they coming from? Where will they be going to? What is the motive? What is the intent behind this work that is so very well known? Now, far more learned scholars than I have tried to understand what Giacometti was about here. It might have to do with a statement about the precarity of life or universal movement that undergirds all human existence. I frankly don't know, and it's not my business this afternoon to explore these difficulties. What I do wish to emphasize, however, is the matter of context. We were just looking at a photograph. These are typically produced by photographers in galleries and museums that have that infinity curve behind it, which utterly isolates that particular piece. This shows you the installation by Giacometti himself with his tousled hair and his ubiquitous cigarette. He's actually moving one of these carvings to place just so an installation in the Galerie Markt in Paris, as photographed by the great Cartier-Bresson some many years ago. We can ask ourselves, what is the juxtaposition of moving things that Giacometti might have been interested in? We can pose that same question of precisely that same bronze, which is not too far from here. It's a few stories above where I am lecturing at this moment. It's on an elevated walkway. You could see my photograph will tell you exactly where it's situated. And here, the curator at the time, perhaps still active here at the National Gallery, decided where to place this sculpture. And we can ask ourselves, why there? Well, in part because it connotes movement, being situated on such a walkway. But it also faces another bronze by Alberto Giacometti that dates to a few years before, and this is the Chariot. Now, it's a well-known art historical game to sort out what the influences might have been here. Some people posit Bronze Age sculptures. Some people might look at carvings from ancient Egypt. Alberto Giacometti himself, in crafting this chariot that you see before you, was mostly apparently thinking about an hallucinatory vision of a pharmacy cart that he happened to see while being hospitalized. Again, it's not my task today to decide which of these is correct. Probably the very act of inspiration is one that hybridizes past experiences and inputs in order to create something new. But we also want to ask ourselves, why are they there? And this curator probably felt, I don't know who it was or how I should ask them as to what their intent might be, but they are in conversation with each other. With each of these carvings, with each of these bronzes, excuse me, with each of these pieces by a great 20th century artist, we're asking all sorts of basic questions, as we should of any piece that implies movement. We want to ask, who are the participants? Who is the actor in that movement? What might be the paths? What might be their beginnings and endings, what we might call the termini? What are the transformations that take place as that person moves over that walkway not far from where I'm speaking? And ultimately, what is the pace and the rhythm here? Why are they moving? When are they moving? Who is moving? To explore this or probe this matter in further detail takes us into the realm of depiction and convention. Some of you are aware of other iconic images of movement. There's Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. There is, going back to Giacometti, his walking man. In each one of these cases, there is an attempt by the artist to convey to you the sense that someone is shifting, moving from somewhere else and going to another location. That is going to be our concern this afternoon as we undertake a study of three different aspects of movement in Maya imagery. Now, again, for those of you who have just come into this series, I am dealing with a civilization that was highly literate. It existed for approximately 1,500 to even 2,000 years. And indeed, it continues robustly into the present in the form of many Mayan speakers whom we are blessed to have in Central America and in Mexico, and indeed in places not far from where we sit today. There are many in the urban centers of the United States. This talk will concern itself with three matters. The first will be a set of concepts having to do with motion, and also what I will describe as the basic logics that undergird them. The second part of this talk will deal with how that movement is depicted and how you might be able to decode it with my helping hand this afternoon. And then finally, we're going to be addressing texting movement, how hieroglyphs themselves are crucial in being able to delimit for you what might be happening in these motions that took place and were depicted about 1,500 years ago or so. Let's begin with the concepts. Let's begin with the logics here. What I can first say to you, and I've underscored it in this image, is that they have to do with their understandings of the human body, which happen to be delineated in decipherable Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions, which I've been working on with colleagues for the past 40 to 50 years. And there have been some signal advances, I believe, in how to use this information in ways that is broadly applicable to imagery. For instance, if you look at this particular glyph, you have to take my word for it. It is reading tikpa, which means at the edge of or at the doorway of a fortification. It happens to be a place name employed in a Maya inscription about 1,400 years ago. It, however, is also the word for mouth. And so what is going on here is a kind of analogy by which my mouth, now speaking to you this beautiful Sunday afternoon, is also being used analogically to describe a doorway or even the edge of something, just as that is ultimately the communicative edge of my body. There's another glyph which I deciphered about in the 1980s, which has to do with the word for chest. Now, the top part of this image is showing you, believe it or not, and there aren't many of these in actual nature, a bipedal fox leaning over. He's a red-chested fox, a chaktan. This is also an expression that is used in describing the firstborn, probably child of a woman, the first of the chest. What better day in which to refer to that kind of concept among the Maya? There's a kind of stylized sternum, maybe even nipples there, as you can partly make out. But the fact of the matter is that body part too, as with the mouth, is used to describe aspects of their built and spatialized world. It is something that is inside of, within, in the center of, and was duly employed by the classic Maya when they're describing some aspect of their landscape. Tan ha means it is within a particularly watery location linked to a kingdom that I've mentioned before, called the Windy Water in northern Guatemala. Another glyph that I deciphered late in the 1980s has to do with another set of, in this case, yet more complex analogies. This is, as Carl Taube has pointed out, my good friend, a depiction of a tamale. It's that delicious maize dough that some of you might have consumed. It's a common Maya foodstuff going many millennia into the past, we presume. It is read, however, as ol, here possessed, in fact, in this particular glyph. That is also applied to the heart that pulses within the chest. Probably there's a concept of a delectable body part that would be savored by the gods, namely of the heart, and it's seen again by analogy as being equivalent to that of a tamale. And then there's this glyph, which was deciphered by David Stewart, again, in that key period from the 1980s to the mid 1990s. Ichonal, which means in front of or at. But in point of fact, I hope you can make out that it is a small hand that's reaching forward. It's attached to a torso. This is a key concept. Again, a body part applicable in ways that radiate outwards. We can first look at a series of observations made by my good colleague Mark Zender and the late Andrea Stone, in which was pointed out that this concept of the ichon, of something that is directly in front of me, and as you look at me, you would also have this inalienable concept applied to your own body. We are in an interactive social space, is one that also helps to explicate, that helps to explain images such as this on a Maya pod. He's leaning over slightly, and the person looking at him and the person just to the viewer's left in this image is within the perceptual space of that person. He is within, or she, or it, within the ichonal of the figure seated on the throne. Now, it's been known for some time that this concept is widely, again, broadly used in many Mayan languages, or some Mayan languages, but there the concept is applicable to anybody. All of you, as I said before, would have the capacity to have this perceptual space in front of you. But in point of fact, if we turn to the Maya data of many, many centuries ago, it is only employed by kings and by gods. Those are the only figures that have seemed to be able or capable of discharging this kind of perceptual space. It tends to dissipate as you look behind. It's probably an indigenous concept to peripheral vision as well. But the important thing to understand is that the area in front is favored by being in front of me as presumably the person endowed with this kind of space. You are in a position of favor, just as anyone behind me that I would not be able to see would be socially deprivileged, socially disfavored. Now, you may ask, why am I bringing up these concepts? Because they help to explain probably the configuring of much Maya space. And I'll even use a somewhat ugly neologism here, which is regiocentricity. That simply means the space that is centered on the king, that is focused on the person of the king. If you examine here a photograph taken in the 1930s of a palatial setting. It's at Piedras Negras. I went back some 50 years after this was photographed and re-excavated this as part of a project at that site with my colleague Hector Escobedo. But if you look at it, you'll see a stairway in front, and you also see that niche, perhaps in back. And it happens that one of the more renowned pieces of Maya carving was discovered there in the 1930s. This is the great throne of Piedras Negras, now circulating in a show. It is, in fact, physically in the Kimball Museum as we speak. Now, if a king were positioned on that throne, imagine, if you will, now that I've coaxed you, I hope, to an understanding of this concept, imagine that everyone in front would be within his ichonal. It's part of his body, it's part of his perception, but it projects outward in ways that are seen as palpably important to the ancient Maya. Let me look at another kind of logic here, now that I've introduced you to the body concepts of space. And this has to do with an idea that comes out of us from the world of physics, fractals and fractalism. I am not going to bore you tonight, this evening, or this early afternoon, I should say, with all of the algorithmic complexities of what physicists think, nor could I explain it to you, frankly. But I'm using the concept fractals here in another, I think, everyday sense, which is, think of it as patterns that are self-similar across different scales. For instance, if you look at this shaman's, Jimen's, table used in a rainmaking ceremony in Mexico, you will perhaps see a table. And if you look very carefully, you'll see 5 different vessels on top of it. And in certain parts of the ceremony, there would be 5 people disposed or arranged spatially around this table. This is a pattern that in fact replicates at all and many different levels of the ancient Maya world as well. There are 4 parts, there is a center, and they define a cosmic whole. Now think again in terms of what I've told you about fractalism, because if we look at this house model, which it was formerly thought to be the home or dwelling of a god, it is, in a sense, configured according to the same fractal principles as the center of a Maya city. This is a plaza in which royal dancers might have performed at some time, and even up into the level of a landscape in which there would be many different cities arranged around a center. How are these fractals? Well, in the first place, each one of them would have an implied center. Now, you can't look inside of that solid stone carving from Copan, dating in this case to approximately 12 to 1300 years ago. But imagine, if you will, that there is a center to it. Notionally, in a typical Maya household, that's where the 3 stones of a hearth might be, through which all daily cooking would take place. You would also see a center in the middle of that plaza that might sometimes be embellished with an altar, but frequently there would be special caches or ritual deposits placed there as well. And then there is, over to viewers right here, the very, very important city in northern Guatemala called El Mirador. Those are the centers. Now look at how the 4 parts are again replicated, almost that same kind of pattern that we saw in a ritual table constructed just a few years ago. But here, as we plumb the centuries and go further back, you will see the 4 beams that might have supported that notional building. You would have seen the 4 temples that help intrinsically to define that space in the middle of a city. And you would see the ancillary or subsidiary cities that are arranged in a 4-part system or sequence around that center, around the city of Mirador. So the 4 quadrants are necessary. They help to define the center, and that fractalism, as you can see, is a logic that begins to play itself throughout that surface. Let's take it to a different scale. Let's look at this shell pectoral worn on the chest. It is in the collection of Dumbarton Oaks, again, not far from here. It is jade studded. It is showing a local ruler seated on a much smaller throne. Now, it just so happens that a throne similar to that was excavated at the city of Izamal in northern Yucatan. And here you can make out the fact that it's flat, and underneath, and I hope you can look really carefully at that, you will see that there are 5 balls that help to support that throne. And if we simply dispose or arrange that horizontally, on which someone might have sat who was in a position of authority here at Izamal many centuries ago, you see that same fractalism playing out, in which there are 4 corners, and then there in the center, presumably stock still, looking out as he configures as Itronal, that perceptual space, is the ruler himself. And so the pattern is small, the pattern is large, the pattern is minute, the pattern is cosmic. What we can also say, again, on the basis of fine ethnographies done today, but also from inferences we might draw from earlier evidence, is that there are 3 aspects to this fractalism, this idea of the 4 parts, then with the idea of a center. The first is that these are innately stabilizing. They innately create a world that is orderly. You can lay out an agricultural field in this way. You can lay out a building. You can lay out a city. The other thing we can say is, in order to maintain that cosmos, there is enjoined on you as a dutiful and morally upright Maya the need to iterate and reiterate that pattern so that that hard-won stability is maintained over the centuries and within daily practice, and also with practices that go over the decades. And then finally, that initial act by which this might have organized the cosmos itself is constantly reenacted, but also in a sense, once that is done, it commemorates those initial acts. So think of this as the blurring and the cross-tying of time itself. Now, there are two examples I'm going to run through for you which show this kind of fractalism, this quadripartition, this centering by which the cosmos is stabilized, by which it is reiterated, by which the past is commemorated in the present. The first one was beautifully studied in a paper at Texas not terribly long ago by my good friend David Stewart, who's an important figure in my field, to say the least. This is of a building that comes from a very tail end of Maya civilization, AD 849. And what it shows is both this image is a photograph of it over to the side as it's been reconstructed. And then that is the planar view to upper viewer's right, which shows its arrangement. How is it laid out? It has 4 stairways. It has 4 entrances. And then around them are, in fact, 4 stelae. These are some of the glories of Maya civilization, the stelae at the city of Seibal itself. I think by now you can understand why I'm including them in this repertoire of fractalism, because what it is showing is it's showing a center and it's showing 4 parts. And it's showing means by which those entrances themselves connote and indeed almost impel movement in and out. Now, the stelae themselves, and I'm going to show you them a bit close up, are a variety of different sizes. All of them refer to one king in particular of the city of Seibal, someone whose name was Watul Atel. We know quite a bit about him. We know that he's coming in fairly late. And in fact, the eastern stela of this configuration of stela around this 4-part building with 4 different entrances is not only the largest, it is also one with a few more dates. And it tells us that this king came from somewhere else. Where did he come from? He came from a city that is oriented physically with respect to Seibal over to the west. So each one of these doorways, as has been pointed out, involves the king himself, Watul Atel, looking outwards. But who's he looking out at? He's looking at a kind of A-list of visitors. This is the most coveted set of invitees that you can imagine, coming respectively from kingdoms which we know to be oriented with respect to the cardinals of those entranceways, the structure A3 at Seibal. Kings who are presiding over kingdoms in the north come through the north doorway, and they are said to be there to preside over this important local ceremony. There are kings coming from the west and kings from the south, and then there is ultimately the arrival of this king who is obviously establishing his rule here by means of this new iteration, this new use of a long-standing idiom of fractalism among the Maya, but now couched in local terms that are suitable to and that work to his purposes. Now, it just so happens that the center stela is the smallest. It's really quite diminutive if you think back to my lecture about scale. And what it shows is that same new ruler, now dressed as the Maya fire god. He is kindling fires directly underneath the stele. What they found were not 3 humdrum stones of the sort you might see in an everyday Maya hearth, but ones made of jade boulders. And my friend Carl Tauba has studied these over the years. And so you see here a sense of celestial movement. Because what would the East be oriented to? It would be the sun itself, a well-known trope for kingship among the Maya, as I've indicated in earlier lectures. And every day you can imagine, if the weather permitted, the sun would pass through that particular portal, through that passageway, along the same route by which this new king came to establish himself and a new dynasty hoped for all time here. And then it would illuminate the fiery solar rituals that are both in the present at AD 49, and then look back to the very first hearth that would have been kindled by gods millennia and millennia in the past. And so what's going on here is both an invocation of the sun and of something that I would call Ur-Maya, something of the very remote past, but also something that seems to be somewhat non-Maya. For here is a fact that I've not mentioned so far. That name that he carries, Watul Atel, is very, very non-Maya. We've not seen that in any other king. It is almost as though he is, again, using a local idiom, in part because he doth protest too much. He is in some ways a foreigner. He is in some ways non-Maya. But there is a creative synthesis here that links kingship itself and with its onset at the city of Seibal with solar patterns and with the movement every day of the sun. Now, I've also noticed the same pattern not too far away in a place about 35 miles from Seibal, and at a time not too terribly distant from the sculptures you were just looking at. And it comes from the city of Machkila. Now, in mapping that was done by the great explorer Ian Graham many years ago, he showed in his plan this peculiar split pyramid that I'm indicating to you here in this map. Where is it? It's on the eastern side. Why is it split? It's because that is where the sun will also come. And so similar sorts of ideas, as I hope to present now, are present here as they were in Seibal, but work through in a very local fashion. Now, it just so happens, too, that one of the strangest of Maya stele, curious indeed in terms of its outline, is right there in front of that split in those pyramids behind. It is stele 13. You can see it dates to 711, December 2nd. It's getting into times in which the solstice is about to occur. Let's decode the imagery for you, insofar as I can do so in a brief time. First of all, there's a depiction of the king, but embodied as the day sign itself, the day signs that were called by the Maya in or sun. He's rising up, and then rising up, in fact, through this strange kind of inverted U, that is a stylized form of the way the Maya would depict the sky itself, not shown as something arching the way we might, or parabolic, but rather as one with rigid curves, as though they reduced such movement to the extremely austerely, the rigorously vertical, and then the horizontals as well. In it, presumably, would have been a text lamentably eroded here that would have told us a little bit more about this king. And then underneath him, he's rising above an embodiment of the vitalized earth underneath. This is a living stone with eyes and nose and mouth looking out after you, at you. This is the curiosity. This is what has long puzzled us about these. And it occurred to me just some months ago that that is the sun god sticking above the sky. And in point of fact, what we're probably looking at is something that is well attested in other parts of the world. It is a gnomon. It is a way of casting shadows that you might see perhaps in the solar dial. And what they are doing here is linking their configuration of the plaza in ways that aren't exactly like Seibal's structure, 3A3, but nonetheless predicated on very similar movements of the sun, which are inevitable and which are throughout, I would say, the world. We see this in ancient Egypt as well, closely bonded to concepts of sacred kingship. There is, I think, no coincidence at all that the king was probably presiding over carving this, setting this up so the sun might be cast on certain times of the day, is and had a name, Sia in Chak. He is the rain god who is born of the sun. This is probably an embodiment of his name. Now, the other broad point I want to make here is that there are daily movements. There are formal movements as well. I come here formally because of contractual understandings and for the sheer joy of it to speak to you every Sunday. But then there would be the daily movements by which you go to the grocery store. You acquire your daily bottle of wine, should that be your druthers. This daily and formal idea of movement is something that is abundantly attested among the living Maya. You can walk along a lake, as this young woman is doing near one of the most spectacularly beautiful places in the world, Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, or you can be involved formally and collectively in movements such as fire walking here in the Highland Mexican community of Chamula in Mexico. The fact of the matter is that formal movements are what I shall be focused on here in the remainder of my talk, and they are expressed in actual road systems, which are like no Dwight D. Eisenhower road system that many of us travel on a routine basis. They're often laid out according to the cardinals or in irradiating lines. These are two such formal roads here. One is of land and the other is of water. The one up above is one of the longest known. It's well over 70 kilometers. It extends from the city of Coba to Yaxuna, depending on, or from Yaxuna to Coba in northern Yucatan. And I noticed immediately that it's running east-west. So it's a little like the sun, but it's also, frankly, like the movement of the sky and of the clouds that bring the rain from the Caribbean by trade winds over the Yucatan Peninsula, eventually to fructify the crops. This is crucial to understand. Now, down below, probably these are of earlier date, you can see ones that were hewn out of living rock to create waterways. And again, these make no sense in terms of practical movement because they start at one point and they're not terribly distant from one another. But we can imagine that canoes also could have been involved in these formal routes. Now, the way in which these routes are identified by the Maya is by means of this glyph. That's a footprint. It's been dipped in ink by some colorant, and it's simply there because, of course, every journey consists of that first step, as you took this morning to come into eventually to this auditorium. This is, in fact, an expression also we'll discuss and explore a little bit in a second or so, but it's important to understand here that that idea of the roadway, the B or the B, is in fact referenced in the inscriptions. They refer to 4 roads, white roads. Why white? Because they are pounded and prepared limestone, crushed in such a way as to delineate those formal surfaces that people would walk over. Or, as Dave Stewart pointed out many years ago, this becomes a way of describing our own lives in which, when we die, we enter the road. So that implies and promises a journey to come that does not cease utterly when we die. And it also is expressed, and I think this might be referring somehow back to Etzna, to death in a number of texts as entering the water. So you're entering the swim, maybe up some sinuous stream of their imagination and of their afterlife. Now, all of this brings us back into the way Mayan languages speak about roads, because what they actually do is they describe every journey as one in which you, in your daily life, are said to be walking. And if I were to ask you, how are you doing? I might ask, how is your road? Now, this idea of roadness, of straightness, of moving in this way is even moral in many Mayan languages. It is the path of virtue. It is the path of truth, of rightness, of behavior that is joined on you all. And so you can now think back to some of those buildings we've looked at and understand it in those terms. Now, another aspect of this we've just begun to explore is this idea of slope paths. And Dave Stewart, in a very recent decipherment, has sorted out that the Maya had a word, which means uphill or above. And it just so happens it seems to be juxtaposed with the term yalan, which is downslope. And so this is not so much the upward and horizontal movement I'll be describing in just a second or so, but it has to do with the intrinsic slopiness, the intrinsically broken landscape that the Maya would know, in which there is very little direct movement. It is always one in which there is some struggle up and down. This is how we find ourselves. We find ourselves above and below. These are incidentally used by the Maya to describe where a tomb is with respect to another tomb. Now, I'm going to get to the second part of my presentation, which has to do with movement. And here I have to tell you that movement goes way back as an illustrative concept and as an image among peoples prior to the Maya. This is an Olmec carving. It's situated on a rock wall above what must have been an old pass many, many centuries ago in the first millennium BC. And it shows a deity moving along. This will help to isolate that drawing a little more carefully. You can make out that he is moving. He is forever in that static motion that you have to interpret somehow. Regrettably, that's a little hard to do because this is a pre-literate people, generally speaking. The first text we see from this time, it's very difficult to date, probably affiliated with that early civilization, is Monument 13 at La Venta, and there you'll see the single footprint, probably telling us that he came from somewhere else. Look at the splayed legs, that also is implying motion. Now, there are enduring conventions among the Maya, Mesoamerica, among the Aztec, I should say, and other Mesoamerican peoples from Mexico, and indeed from Central America, by which we can delimit movement, by which it can be encoded graphically. not all paths are created the same. And in this particular image, which comes from the early colonial period, but was very much vested with Aztec concepts, it's from central Mexico, you can see those same footprints moving from one temple to the other, a place where, in fact, skulls are being displayed, probably as a result of sacrificial captives. Now, there's another aspect of this, which is the movement itself is not often or always linear, but it's also seen in its sacred dimension to be counterclockwise. And here from a similar document, you can make out that the footprints all the way around, which probably involve this frenetic activity, which I regrettably don't have time to get into here in this document dating to the late 1550s, is describing that same kind of counterclockwise motion, but in temple precincts. It also applies to daily life. This is a wonderful image of what happens when a midwife, we're thinking here also of motherhood, is off screen, is assigning roles in a gendered fashion to young children. Women get, I regret to say, distaffs for weaving and brushes for cleaning the house, and up above are the insignia of warriors that boys might receive. Now look at the footprints in which the midwife and presumably the babies, the young children, the toddlers she happens to be carrying, are moving around in counterclockwise fashion. Now, it has been argued that this counterclockwise pattern is also evident abundantly in the material that I happen to study. You could make this argument by looking at the sides of a Maya carving, as here at the city of Piedras Negras in Guatemala. And you'll have to take my word for it that the text begins to the left-hand side of the monument. You'd walk around to see the front, and then you would conclude your reading of that text by going eventually to the right-hand side, and that is a counterclockwise motion. The fact of the matter, though, is that that motion is simply how a literate Maya would read a text. You go from left to right. And I think that's the dominant pattern here, not some sort of ritual activity. And I'm even going to introduce a little bit of a heresy to say that the Maya clearly understood roads and journeys in terms of footprints, but they did not use them. And we know this because of exceptions that are in themselves tests of the rule. These are from a Maya city, but they are being produced by artists vested in the graphic traditions of distant Teotihuacan. You see the footprints of journeys. You see them leading down below. And there's even an example of this that was found at Copan in Honduras. And the fact of the matter is we leave those images behind, which come from approximately AD 400 to 500 or thereabouts. We can leap to far later evidence from the latest, probably the latest surviving Maya codex just prior to the Spanish conquest. This is the Dresden, which is an extraordinary achievement. It refers to deities walking on roads, and there you see the same footprints, which by now you understand as a system of encoding for movement here in Mesoamerica. There's even a crossroads down below in which this spaghetti of paths seems to intersect. But the fact of the matter is this: when I do a kind of survey of such images and such depictions and such encodings, the fact of the matter is they're always at these moments of contact with the non-Maya. They always appear in late instances too, in which there is this fusing of, there's this saturation of influence from distant parts of the Maya world. The reason for this is because the Maya in this case are relying on inscriptions to communicate the idea of movement. And so whatever is being deployed graphically is actually in part withheld in order to be sequestered there. How do they show movement? Well, as in this particular roll out of a pot, which shows returning warriors, they've got trophy heads, at least half of them do. They have the flayed faces of captives on some of their staffs. And there in front is a single, not very happy looking captive. His head is flung back. And from my last lecture, you'll know that he is probably singing a song of lamentation, which is in fact mentioned among the far later Aztec as well. Movement is taking place there. How is it being communicated geographically? It's being shown by means of a ground line. In other words, they're not showing perspectives as my late friend Sam Edgerton would have studied. Rather, what they're doing is they're reducing it to a single thread, a single rope almost of movement, of slightly overlapping figures, but generally left intact with all of their outlines so as to maintain the clarity of this image. And they're moving counter to the image that you would see in writing. They're moving out to the left. And you, as the viewer, would presumably start with a captive. You might even be re-embodying that particular role, and you engage with the triumphant warriors who are probably returning from battle. These ground lines are well attested in the graffiti that was produced by the ancient Maya. These are unmediated productions. They're being produced probably by youths, as some people have argued. I suggest that next week that that's not always the case. But these too will have ground lines in these much more informal productions that are probably being scrawled in the walls by people that are not supposed to be doing this. Look at the wavering yellow line here. That's a ground line, but replicated so that every time you look at that image, you would, in a sense, conclude your interpretation of that scene. You go above, or perhaps probably in reverse order. There's a sense of sequencing here. There's another example, also in graffiti, recorded by my friend, by colleagues working at Yashar, Guatemala, in which now it's looping. It seems to be going through that downslope, upslope, and yet there is a segmentation to what should be understandable as a very informal production. It's actually imbued with all sorts of social and hierarchical ideas of space. There are singers initially, then there are a variety of musicians. There is the main dancer, what I call the focal performer in my last talk. There are parasol holders. This could come right out of the Ashanti-speaking peoples of Africa. And then finally, there's a trumpeter. The point I'm making here is that there are four different aspects of this. You see the body. You understand their motion. You understand as well what direction they are moving in. And then there is this notion of finitude, of a kind of segmentation of this person starts that particular sequence, this person ends it. And above all, it is steeped in hierarchy of someone in the middle who's more important than the person who came first and the person who came last. We saw this, of course, in the recent coronation of King Charles III. I'm going to conclude here by looking at texting movements. I hope ushered you into an understanding of how to look at movement and motion and begin to infer something of what it might mean. And here we are dealing with a variety of different textual notations that tell us about how the Maya categorized movement. It's not an infinity. It's not an endless welter of different terms. They tend to box themselves into a variety, a limited, finite number of expressions. We can have the concept of tali, of coming from somewhere. We can have the idea of huli, I've arrived at the auditorium to give you your talk. Bishin is what happened in between. That is a sense of movement. And then there is the idea of the urgency of that passage, ani, of walking or running. And then ultimately, as you will, I hope, return to your homes, of coming back full circle. There's a cyclicity that is implicit here. That was horizontal movement. And you'll see here I'm making an explicit link or tie to the motions we were describing in the imagery. There's also vertical movement. And this corresponds to lukoyi, which means to move out, and it is depicted as a serpent that comes out, usually at the beginning of the rainy season. I've done lots of mapping, and I must have had a death wish because there are vipers everywhere. That's when they're flushed out. It has an implicit seasonality. Then there is, in the second example, a word deciphered by Dave Stewart many years ago, abai, which means to rise up. But here it is shown, believe it or not, as a stylized footprint, which you should be able to recognize, going up a temple platform. So it has a ritual dimension or component here. And then there's another word that's been beautifully studied by Mark Zender, amei, which means to fall or come down. And it has this almost an intimation of celestial catastrophe, of the endings of world. There is almost innately here too, I would say, as a nuance, a feeling of topographic sloping by which the Maya would also break down and help to soften this austere distinction between the horizontal and the vertical. And that is implicit, I think, in the footprint of someone who is moving up a temple. Again, they're not showing many footprints, they're showing one. This is a Maya idiom, not that of later and other peoples in Mesoamerica. Now, I mentioned before this idea of movement. There's also of things that move overhead. Think back to the stela I showed you from the city of Machkila, in which the sky band, this way in which they distill the essence of the sky, is broken into these very, very hard angles. That idea of moving across is part of a class of verbs, again studied by David Stewart here, numlita cha numlita kab. They move, it moves across the sky, it moves across the earth. You are posed here as all of us are in our daily lives, under earth and over the earth and under the sky. Now I'm going to end here by just looking at one example. Actually, there are two further examples to look at, which is describing textually such movement. And it comes from a sacrificial altar that is now at the city of Copan. And it was carved there in AD 776. And what it shows, I should tell you, is the alpha and omega of the kingly branch of the family, in which the first king is speaking, and possibly existentially, this would be, of course, beyond the pale, to the last king. They're all gathered in a kind of communion around the periphery of this carving, which has underneath the name glyphs of these figures. The top of that altar, which must surely have been used for sacrifices, we can imagine it covered and probably partly concealed by gouts of blood and other kinds of debris and an incense, tells us about a journey by which the Alpha came eventually to become the Omega. It starts with the reception of kingship in 426, there we go, at the city probably of Teotihuacan, that distant place in Mexico that the Maya frequently thought about, almost as though it were their Rome with respect to other kingdoms. It was the summit of prior civilization and of where ultimately power and legitimacy would come. Now we know on this monument, dating to this time, that a few years later, he has decided to leave Teotihuacan. 3 days have passed. He, or rather a deity, rests eventually because now they have made all their way after some 7 months to the city of Copan itself. And there is Huli they arrive at. And so there's a kind of story being told here, the ultimate story here, the very ending, takes us generations later to the time of the Omega, the final king, who commissioned this carving. And there he says that he is raising it above in that akol, that upslope concept I introduced you to before, above the tomb of the founder, which was eventually discovered by my undergraduate mentor, the late Robert Scher. And down below, the referring probably is the erection of something out of wood, some kind of scaffold, which has long since disappeared. And so what we're seeing here is a sense of movement as involving the distant, the exotic, but ultimately the legitimating, of validating. For it is not by being here and simply being local by which that kind of prestige is derived. It comes from these distant connections to distant but important kingdoms. And I think you can also make out that here, textually handled, is a sense of a narrative, a story that has a beginning, it has a series of middles, and it has an ending by which you eventually come around. Now, this idea of templates is found in a very few other examples. Huli, how is it first depicted in the hieroglyphs? It's shown as a finger, an index finger, pointing up at the new crescent, which of course you would not have seen before unless you were very, very keen-eyed, and eventually would grow and become the full moon itself. This is an expression that begins in astronomical context, as far as we can tell, and then it is extended and applied analogically to royal movements as well. This is how the Maya show the concept of arrival, that they originated in something celestial and something that is tangibly non-human. Not surprisingly, who are some of the people connected with this concept of arrival? Well, it's a new queen, for instance, being brought here to revitalize a kingdom, in this case, the city of Naranjo. They refer to her arrival, and they also refer to her very explicitly and overtly as someone who impersonates the moon goddess. And it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see inherently that link between lunar cycles and that of female ones as well. Some of the languages even refer to menstruation in terms of arrival. We have days that come and go, again, applied by the Maya, not only to sojourns and journeys of some days, but eventually to entering the road, to walking into the afterlife. This is an example of warriors coming and going, using this expression of Bishin. It's a ruin of a pot. It's got a lot of repainting, but the glyphs are relatively clear. It describes someone going, but then what I find really quite relevant here, pronouncedly so, is that the people moving in this fashion are doing so in the guise of gods. In this instance, whoever there is highlighted in the center of this is coming as a sun god. There are dwarves being described, or maybe toddlers, thinking of Mother's Day, who refer to this act of motion. But almost paradoxically, we don't think of toddlers, we don't think of dwarves as being moving at great dispatch. This is how the Maya, perhaps even in this kind of puckish wit, are showing such motion. It is probably something to do with habitual or processional activity. And there you can see it over to the side, but with that sense of inherent urgency, something you were impelled to do that drives you on. This idea of motion and of rhythm and pace, which I alluded to earlier in that piece by Giacometti, is, I think, relevant here, because this idea of urgency is also found in indigenous traditions, going to northern Mexico, into the American Southwest. We have Hopi foot runs, or we have some of the greatest runners in the world, indigenous groups in northern Mexico, who don't wear footwear in order to protect themselves. They have no sneakers, but they move urgently in ways that are not just about a marathon, but about a marathon of the spirit, and one that is ultimately transformational. It's hard not to see some of that urgency and some of that rhythm in the formal roads that I described to you before. And then how does it all come to an end? Well, you come around to your beginning. And this is an expression that also is highlighted in the very third word of my talk today, which is coming around and coming back, as we ultimately do. It is part of the cyclicity that is part and parcel of human existence. Where do we see this term? Well, we see it, among other things, in caves, where people come on pilgrimages again and again. And it reads, Pakshi, to return. And what happens as a result of that in one text within this particular cave in northern Guatemala at Nactunich? What happens is that someone has seen the road, but it is almost visionary in addition to the physical motion. And they have also seen a part of their spirit, the why. There's some vertical motion as well. It is dynastic in this instance, a people that are forced out as a result of dynastic tumult at the end of the classic period. And here they're forced into an exile, but notice that they are employing the same tropes of the snake that comes out, and then the foot that goes up the temple. There are two tandem kind of messages here, and this must be implicit there with all the other citations that I've given you today of human motion, but always there is that secondary aside, that sideways look, that allusion to the movement of gods and the movement of the beings that they embody. And so this idea of merchants, this idea of going up, of from and to, takes us back to this pot that I had highlighted there as the illustrative image, the exemplary image for this particular presentation. Think of motion not as being frozen or static, but as in the case of Giacometti upstairs, as a motion that has a beginning, that has an end, and it has this midway point that is a spurious stasis that is not entirely there. I've been able to communicate, I hope this morning, or this afternoon rather, some of the nuances of how we can go about accessing these meanings about the Maya, of how these are in fact illustrated by glyphic text. Ultimately, who, why, and when matters. And it's a question we must always pose of this material. We have also reduced this in part to horizontal motion by which you come and you go, a vertical motion by which you go up, by which you come down, as part of this endless flux of life. This is also exemplified by the celestial bodies that ultimately served as a template for these activities. And so I would say here that in all Maya imagery, as I conclude, we are not only looking at the human, but perforce we are accessing the supernatural. It is always there as a companion to any depiction, to any reference that might occur in these inscriptions. They are reciprocal, they invoke each other in turn. And so there have been obvious graphs here from the human onto the supernatural in thinking about this with the moon and the sun. But can there be no doubt that the plain assertion here is that the fundamental meaning of movement, which I've been trying to get to this afternoon, is that it is what it means to be alive. Rising up, descending, running, and walking with urgency, with dilatory motion. It doesn't really matter as long as we keep moving, because this is how we become ourselves. Thank you. I'm back now.